Gareth O'Shea John, counterintuition.com. Hello. So the Oklahoma State University College of Human Environmental Sciences this week released a publication called Spare the Rod? New research challenges spanking critics. I'm not sure if you've seen my article called Just Spare the Rod, but I would highly suggest you check that out. It's I'll link it to this video on YouTube, and you can just go straight to counterintuition.com and take a look. The first half of the article is pretty much the history of spanking. The second half is like the physiological and medical effects of spanking. So if you want to just skip to that, just go halfway down the page and take a look at that. It's all sourced, it's all linked. We got the latest research all linked to, so you can check that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through this publication and pause where appropriate and just give a rational response and explanation for what's going on here. Okay, so opposition to parents spanking their children has been growing significantly in elite circles over the past 15 years. Okay, so I'll pause right there. Within the first sentence, you can see already you can see the motivation of this publication is not the most objective, because already they're, this author, whoever he is, I think there's a collaboration of people, but they using the term elite circles, it implies that, anti-spanking is like the new kind of hippie thing you do, and it's, people who don't have anything better to do with their time are always looking for new things and new fads and whatever. So that's, I think, what they're getting at here. So already, that just kind of that tones the article down already. So, okay, I'll carry on. No doubt much of this opposition springs from a sincere concern for the well-being of children. Child abuse is a reality, and stories of child abuse are horrifying. But while loving and effective discipline is quite definitely not harsh and abusive, neither is it weak and ineffectual. Indeed, disciplinary spanking can fall well within the bounds of loving discipline and need not be labelled abusive violence. Or so most Americans seem to think. According to a recent voter consumer research poll commissioned by the Family Research Council, 76% of the more than 1,000 Americans surveyed said that spanking was an effective form of discipline in their home when they were children. These results are made all the more impressive by the fact that nearly half of those who answered otherwise grew up in homes in which they were never spanked. Taken together, more than 4 out of 5 Americans who were actually spanked by their parents as children say that it was an effective form of discipline. In addition, Americans perceive lack of discipline to be the biggest problem in public education today, according to a recent Gallup poll. Several studies show strong public support for corporal punishment by parents. So, saying that spanking is effective is not an argument for spanking, okay? Concentration camps are effective if you're an evil dictator, okay? Raping somebody is effective if you don't have the capacity to be in a loving relationship. Spanking is effective if you don't want to take the time to invest in your child. It's as simple as that, okay? So anyway, we'll go into more of that. But I just want to say that, again, the premise laid out at the very start of the publication is that spanking is effective, therefore it's good. There's no doubt that spanking is effective at getting immediate compliance in the moment. But what's being debated here, not debated, I mean, there really isn't a debate. With my article, what I was showing was that it's the long-term effects, and we're talking years into the future, and now we have the research because it's taken so long to get. This is, we're going back 60 years of research here, and we're able to see now, when you take groups together, it isn't to say that spanking is 100% causal, but that spanking is a predictor. It's one of the factors that you can use to predict future outcome in behavior. So saying that spanking is effective is not what is on debate here. I'm not debating whether spanking is effective or not. I know that spanking works in the moment, but its long-term effects are absolutely abhorrent. So we'll get to that. Okay, so back to the article. Actually, no, before I do, taken together, perceive a lack of discipline to be the biggest problem in public education today. The biggest problem in public education today is that children aren't hit. Are you serious? It's not the fact that, you just have these schools that you can ship your kids off because you want to just carry on a career or stay at home and watch Ricky Lake. It's public education by itself is a problem. So to say that the lack of discipline is a problem to public education is just weird. It's just it's a silly thing to say. Yes, several studies show strong public support for corporal punishment by parents. I mean, Okay. Again, aside from the fact that this is the sources that are linked are questionable, but even if it was true, it's not the argument. We're talking about ethics and principle here. We're talking about what's right and wrong. We don't look at the vast majority of the people. If we looked at the vast majority of the people in Russia, 100 years ago, we could have got a picture that, the gulags were a great idea, or, killing Jews was a great idea when you asked the vast majority of Catholics, 100 years ago. It's not. That's not that has no bearing on the argument whatsoever. I'll continue. Critics claim that spanking a child is abusive and contributes to adult dysfunction. These allegations arise from studies that fail to distinguish appropriate spanking from other forms of punishment. Abusive forms of physical punishment, such as kicking, punching, and beating, are commonly grouped with mild spanking. Furthermore, the studies usually include and even emphasize corporal punishment of adolescents rather than focusing on preschool children, where spanking is more effective. This blurring of distinctions between spanking and physical abuse and between children of different ages gives critics the illusion of having data condemning all disciplinary spanking. This is misleading. I'll go into this shortly when we get to the studies that he's citing are not the studies that I was citing anyway. But what he's saying is it's more effective on hitting younger children, probably because they can't call the police, they can't tell people their story and be credible in society, and don't have any economic independence. And so yes, smaller children are more susceptible. There's no doubt. That's just you can logically do that. You don't need any studies to show that. So I agree with him there. But again, not sure exactly how that's a defense of spanking. There are several arguments commonly leveled against disciplinary spanking. Interestingly, more of these arguments can be used against other forms of discipline. Any form of discipline, time-out, restriction, when used inappropriately and in anger, can result in distorting a child's perception of justice and harming his emotional development. In light of this, let's examine some of the unfounded arguments promoted by spanking opponents. But just before I go on, yes, any form of discipline, time-out, restriction, all that kind of stuff, yes, I would say absolutely, exactly, just the same criticisms that could be leveled against spanking can be done against time-out restrictions and yelling and that kind of stuff. Absolutely. I don't disagree with him there. And that's why I would be also against timeouts and those kinds of disciplines. So, and discipline in general, it's just a weird thing to be talking about. How should I best discipline my wife? There really were arguments for this not so long ago. How should I best discipline my slaves? Again, there were very, very good, well-reasoned out arguments for how you should discipline your slaves. But the ethics kind of, trumps all that. So the efficacy of discipline is not at all, again, what's important here. So in the light of this, let's examine some of the unfounded arguments promoted by spanking opponents. Again, unfounded arguments promoted by spanking opponents. I'm not sure if is that legitimately disingenuous way of putting that statement, or are they just not capable of stringing the sentence together? Because this is a state university, so I'm assuming that they know. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they know how to make an argument. And therefore, when they put in things like, let's examine some of the unfounded arguments promoted by spanking opponents, if you wanted an objective, reasonable look at this, you would say, let's look at some of the arguments and see if they are founded. So, anyway. So argument one, many psychological studies show that spanking is an improper form of discipline. Okay, so that's never going to be one of my arguments anyway, because it's improper form of discipline still implies that there are proper forms of discipline, and there aren't. There are no proper forms of discipline. Now, I should define discipline is that basically you are imposing your will on another person against their will, when there is obviously no threat or whatever. The kid isn't picked up a shotgun and put it to your head or his own head or whatever. I mean, if you jump in and grab the gun off him, that's not immoral, right? But the discipline, clean your room or you don't get any Xbox, and no, you don't. That's just you don't do that to anybody else. Why would you do it with your kid? So I'll continue on. The counterpoint that he has here. Researchers John Lyons, Rachel Anderson and David Larson of the National Institute of Healthcare Research recently conducted a systematic review of the research literature on corporal punishment. They found that 83% of the 132 identified articles published in clinical and psychological journals, psychosocial journals, were merely opinion-driven editorials, reviews or commentaries, devoid of new empirical findings. Moreover, most of the empirical studies were methodologically flawed by grouping the impact of abuse with spanking. The best studies demonstrated beneficial, not detrimental effects of spanking in certain situations. Clearly, there is insufficient evidence to condemn parental spanking and adequate evidence to justify its proper use. This is absolutely incorrect. So, John Lyons, Rachel Anderson, David Larson, they took articles. It's cited as 132 identified articles. Identified where? I don't know. It's not actually linked in this article. What we have is a link to their memo, which is them stating that 132 articles that were identified by anti-spanking advocates, 83% of them, were just opinion and reviews and commentaries. In my article, I cited the 20 most recent are not at all opinion driven whatsoever. They very clearly show empirical evidence as to the effects of spanking versus not spanking, or at least 18 of the 20 specifically identify spanking as just taken on its own outside of other punitive methodologies, and spanking is identified as not in anger and not to cause any abuse to the child, no tissue damage. It's just controlled smack on the rear end, and that's basically what they were defining spanking as, and that's what they then leveled that out against all of the research they had found, and then they were able to extrapolate the data from that. So that's absolutely incorrect. I mean, sure, if I wanted to make an argument against somebody and they had 20 articles that all, or 20 studies that all showed a particular thing, what I would do is I would take another 110 articles that don't show anything, group them together and say, yeah, there was 132 and 83% of them were incorrect. Yeah, but what about the 17%, which is actually credible? So they don't cite the studies, the 132 identified articles. They don't cite that at all. And now I'd be happy to take a look at those if somebody could provide them to me, but they haven't done that on the website. So no, it's absolutely incorrect. So nobody is talking about 132. Anyway, okay. So the best studies demonstrated beneficial, not detrimental effects of spanking. Now, would that or would that not be opinion-driven statement right there? The best studies demonstrated beneficial is the best studies demonstrated my argument is correct. Anyway, okay, I'll continue. Argument 2. Physical punishment establishes the moral righteousness of hitting other persons who do something which is regarded as wrong. The counterpoint is, the spanking teaches hitting belief has gained in popularity over the past decade, but is not supported by objective evidence. A distinction must be made between abusive hitting and non-abusive spanking. A child's ability to discriminate hitting from disciplinary spanking depends largely upon the parent's attitude with spanking and the parent's procedure for spanking. There is no evidence in the medical literature that a mild spank to the buttocks of a disobedient child by a loving parent teaches the child aggressive behavior. Okay, so there's 2 points here. First of all, it's not that you're teaching the child to hit. We know that, right? When you spank a child, the whole purpose is to cause pain in order to alter behavior. And what's happening when you do that is you are modeling that. It's not teaching in the classical sense. You're not saying, you get your blackboard out and you're this is where you hit the child on the rear end and you have to hit them with this amount of joules in order to get the desired behavioral response. They're not teaching, but they're modeling. Any experience a child goes through is a model. Whatever they observe, whatever they see. Now, I would argue, right, that for a parent to hit a child in anger is better than with a calm, loving, demeanor, because that's genuinely terrifying. At least if you're being, the person is angry and they're aggressive, you can go, okay, I can reject that. That's obviously my parents or they have a temper, they're crazy, whatever. Later on, you can look back and it's much more easy to differentiate loving relationships from abusive relationships. When someone is smiling at you or talking calmly and saying, look, I told you now, don't do that, or I would hit you now, I'm going to spank you. Okay, and that's like sadistic because it's calculated. Like you go and get a wooden spoon, or maybe some people use their hands or whatever, but some people use a wooden spoon or whatever, some small device. And it's that's the definition of sadism. I'm going to alter behavior in you by causing a negative response through force. Not force in the sense that I'm, choking you or whatever, but you do have to hold the child down. I don't know many children who are going to willingly bend over and take a spanking. Like you do have to physically restrain them. It's insane. What's actually being talked about here is it's sadistic. It's flat out sadistic. So there is no evidence in the medical literature that a mild mild spank by a loving parent teaches the child aggressive behavior. That is not true, and I would tell you to go to my article for that one. I cite numerous studies that show quite the opposite. We'll go into that. No, you know what? I'll do it right now. No, hold on. Okay, I'll read on I'll finish this point and then I'll go to it. So the critical issue is how spanking, or in fact any punishment, is used more so than whether it is used. Physical abuse by an angry, uncontrolled parent will leave lasting emotional wounds and cultivate bitterness and resentment within a child. The balanced, prudent use of disciplinary spanking, however, is an effective deterrent to aggressive behavior with some children. Researchers at the Center for Family Research at Iowa State University studied 332 families to examine both the impact of corporal punishment and the quality of parental involvement on 3 adolescent outcomes: aggressiveness, delinquency, and psychological well-being. The researchers found a strong association between the quality of parenting and each of these 3 outcomes. Corporal punishment, however, was not adversely related to any of these outcomes. This study proves the point that quality of parenting is the chief determinant of favourable or unfavourable outcomes. Remarkably, childhood aggressiveness has been more closely linked to maternal permissiveness and negative criticism than to even abusive physical discipline. It is unrealistic to expect that children would never hit others if their parents would only exclude spanking from their discipline options. Most children in their toddler years, long before they are ever spanked, naturally attempt to hit others when conflict or frustration arises. The continuation of this behaviour is largely determined by how the parent or caregiver responds. If correctly disciplined, the hitting will become less frequent. If ignored or ineffectually disciplined, the hitting will likely persist and even escalate. Thus, instead of contributing to greater violence, spanking can be a useful component in an overall plan to effectively teach a child to stop aggressive hitting. This is just flat out incorrect. None of this is true. It's painful to read, but it's none of it's true. I'm having to hold my tongue every sentence. So the study proves the point that quality parenting is the chief determinant of favourable or unfavourable outcomes. That is not, again, this is not what's in question here. I mean, absolutely, if you have a family where the parents are sitting around and they're all shooting up heroin and they're yelling at each other, they're throwing cups and plates at each other, and and they're getting their kid to sell drugs for them, and the kid doesn't get any books, they don't talk to him, all that stuff is far worse than spanking. Yes. In the same way, you don't have to smoke to get lung cancer. But that doesn't mean you say, well, smoking is not the chief determinant of lung cancer. Therefore, we should continue teaching our children to smoke. That's not, it's one factor out of numerous factors, absolutely. But that's not an argument for it. It is unrealistic to expect that children would never hit others. Of course, it's completely unrealistic. What we need to do is teach them not to hit. I mean, this is the whole point. Children experiment and they have natural biological impulses towards danger and towards frustration and anger. As a parent, your job is to stem that frustration and anger and show children how to adequately and more acceptably exhibit whatever feelings they're having. Just simply asking them how they're feeling, give it a name. That's you're angry right now. Why are you angry? You talk about why you're angry and how do we fix it? What's the solution? What do we do? And hitting is the response when you don't know what else to do. It's just and that's exactly where I think parents get it. Because when parents get to their wits' end with their child, they're like, okay, forget it, I'm just going to hit you. That's exactly the point. So hitting is never okay, and calling it spanking is just the height of dishonesty. You're just giving it another name. How is it not hitting? I mean, it's like if somebody frustrates you on the street and they're stealing your stuff or whatever, and you punch them in the face, you don't say, oh, that's not abusive because that's there, you did it in love and you smiled at him or something. No, you hit them and it is abusive, but it was in response to a felt danger or a felt frustration. That's exactly what's happening with parents. Their children are frustrating them, they're making them angry, and the parent is driven towards hitting them. And so the argument has moved from there was never an argument whether you should do it in anger or not. Up until very recently, the argument has had to get more sophisticated as the technology and as as cameras are in places, as people are actually starting to listen to children a bit more, and people will intervene if you're being abusive. So you've had to come up with, parents who want to spank have had to come up with more sophisticated arguments to justify the behaviour, and those would include, well, don't do it when you're angry and then it's okay. Well, no, it's not okay because you're still hitting, and in fact, I would argue it is far worse to be hit by someone who's smiling at you, because you're saying a loving relationship is something where the person can control you and hit you and then smile and give you a cookie when you're done. It's like, Whoa, that's messed up, man. That's proper sadistic. So, okay, argument 3. Since parents often refrain from hitting until the anger or frustration reaches a certain point, the child learns that anger and frustration justify the use of physical force. Okay, counterpoint. A study published in Pediatrics indicate that most parents who spank do not spank on impulse, but purposefully spank their children with a belief in its effectiveness. This is not true. And saying a study published in Pediatrics, I think they linked to it, so I'll have a look at that. But that's absolutely not true. No, as far as I know, the last I heard it was between 70 and 80% of parents have hit their child in a situation where they were angry, and the same percentage of people, if they were given an alternative, they would take it. So what we're looking at here is desperation. We're looking at frustration because they don't know what to do with their kid and they're desperate, and so hitting is the thing to do. So that one study that they've cited in Pediatrics is at odds with the 20 or so studies that I cited in my article, and much more recent studies as well. But they do take place over a much longer period of time, a much bigger sample. All these studies that are sourced here are nothing in compared to these studies. They don't take the same time frame. They don't take the same data range. Okay, furthermore, the study revealed no significant correlation between the frequency of spanking and the anger reported by mothers. Actually, the mothers who reported being angry were not the same parents who spanked. I don't even understand. Revealed no significant correlation between the frequency of spanking and the anger reported by mothers. Actually, the mothers who reported being angry were not the same parents who spanked. Well, wouldn't that be because the mothers who spanked got the anger out in their child's rear end? Just saying. Moving on. Reactive, impulsive hitting after losing control due to anger is unquestionably the wrong way for a parent to use corporal punishment. Eliminating all physical punishment in the home, however, would not remedy such explosive scenarios. It could even increase the problem. When effective spanking is removed from a parent's disciplinary repertoire, he or she is left with nagging, begging, belittling and yelling once the primary disciplinary measures such as timeout and logical consequences have failed. By contrast, if proper spanking is proactively used in conjunction with other disciplinary measures, better control of the particularly defiant child can be achieved and moments of exasperation are less likely to occur. This is just like the standard. The bar is so low. So you take away spanking and what do you have? Nagging, begging, belittling and yelling. No, that's really not what you have. What you're left with is an actual relationship with your child. You're not peddling your kid off to some state school and you're spending time with them and you're spending spending your time studying and sharing and talking and playing and coloring and all the things that you do with a kid, like it as a full-time job. We don't really have a whole lot of examples of that these days because it's so expensive to live right now that we're almost in an environment where we have to send our kids to school, but almost in that environment. I would say that with every ounce of my being, I'm going to fight against that, and that my child will not set one foot in a public school or a private school unless the child wants to themselves. I mean, they can check it out. I'm sure they'll be curious to see what it's like, but I'm sure they'll come home with their helmet on, from the shrapnel and the terror of a horrible like if I don't prepare my child for a horrible environment by bringing yelling and timeouts and all that kind of stuff, they're just going to respond negatively in a school environment because that's not the real world. That's when you hit and you yell and you spank and you give timeouts and you do all these consequences, you're preparing a child to put up with that in public school. So they're much more able to adjust in public school, and then after public school they're much more able to adjust to living in a country where you have a government that takes all their stuff and punishes them, for the most arbitrary of offences. So no, you are not left with nagging, begging, belittling and yelling once spanking and timeouts are gone. I mean, this is this is really sad. Like, it's really sad that this is the guy who gets to, I mean, it's great you have the internet, anybody can go on there and share their stuff, but, at the same time, like, we need better representation, in the mainstream, for, how does this guy get away with it? Like, I would be so embarrassed saying that if I was a parent. I was, once you take away the disciplinary repertoire of spanking, I have to nag my child. Well, no. I mean, what does my child want? I mean, say about your wife, okay? So once I take away my disciplinary repertoire of spanking, all I can do is nag my wife or beg my wife or belittle my wife or yell at her. I mean, no. We have a relationship. We talk, we share, we go out and we have dinner and we live together. I mean, that's what we do. So, it's weird. Anyway, all right. Argument 4. Physical punishment is harmful to a child. Counterpoint. Any disciplinary measure, physical, verbal or emotional, carried to an extreme can harm a child. Excessive scolding and berating of a child by a parent is emotionally harmful. Excessive use of isolation, which is timeout, for unreasonable periods of time can humiliate a child and ruin the measure's effectiveness. Obviously, excessive or indiscriminate physical punishment is harmful and abusive. However, an appropriately administered spanking of a forewarned disobedient child is not harmful when administered in a loving, controlled manner. Without the prudent use of spanking for the particularly defiant child, a parent runs the risk of being inconsistent and rationalizing the child's behavior. This inconsistent manner of parenting is confusing and harmful to the child and is damaging to the parent-child relationship. There is no evidence that proper disciplinary spanking is harmful to the child. I mean, this is the height of newspeak. This is just flipped topsy-turvy talk. So without the prudent use of spanking, what he's talking about here is using it sometimes and not other times. Sure, that's pretty bad. But what's even worse is doing it consistently. Saying the inconsistent manner of parenting is confusing and harmful to the child and damaging to the parent-child relationship. Let me tell you what's damaging to a parent-child relationship. So your child is unhappy with what the relationship has given them so far. Okay, so they're not happy with a particular course of events or a particular outcome of a discourse, or they just don't want what you've given them, or they don't want to do what you tell them. You then grab the child or take them by the hand and ask them in a calm voice, "Step with me into the bathroom," or "Step with me into the bedroom. And in some cases, I'm going to remove your pants and I'm going to hit you with a wooden spoon. It's because I love you and I don't want you to be disobedient." Okay? That is probably, I mean, that's got to be up there with one of the strangest, most harmful things you can do in any relationship ever. I mean, just, again, apply it to any other relationship with any other person, and you're dealing with prison time, you deal with a child. I mean, how much more are you accountable to a child who can't even, they didn't ask to be born, they didn't ask to have you as a family, they can't leave, they're economically dependent on you, they're socially dependent on you, they're intellectually dependent on you, and you're going to impose a standard on them that you would not impose on your worst enemy. Okay, this moral standard that they don't obviously even understand, and they don't understand it. The older they get, and they still don't understand, it's because of you as a parent. You've not provided. It's your job as a parent to provide for them the ability to stay away from anything that could even remotely result in any kind of a physical. I mean, it's abuse. I want to avoid doing that because I want to be, kind to the guy writing this. But you're hitting someone. I mean, come on. What do you think you're doing when you call it spanking? The whole point is it has to hurt. It has to hurt them, in order to change the behavior. If it didn't, you wouldn't be doing it. I mean, it's the whole. Anyway, argument 5. Physical punishment makes the child angry at the parent. All forms of punishment initially elicit a frustrated, angry response from a child. Progression of this anger is dependent primarily upon the parent's attitude during and after the disciplinary event, and the manner of its application. Any form of punishment administered angrily for the purposes of retribution, rather than calmly for the purposes of correction, can create anger and resentment in the child. Actually, a spanking can break the escalating rage of a rebellious child and more quickly restore the relationship between parent and child. Now, in that entire paragraph, there was no sources whatsoever. Look, this is if the standard, and this is what I do whenever someone's making an argument, they're making a statement, I extrapolate the principle from what they're saying. I take it as a universal when they say it as a universal, and then I reapply it. So when we go back to the top of the publication, we say, well, one of the criticisms against all these studies, the 132 studies that I plucked out of the air, the problem with them is that these 3 other people, I didn't even do it myself, but these other 3 people who I trust determined that these articles were all opinion driven. And then he makes an entire counterpoint to one of his arguments and says, actually, a spanking can break the escalating rage of a rebellious child and more quickly restore the relationship between parent and child. Where is your evidence for that? That's an incredibly broad and definitive statement with no evidence whatsoever. So no, you don't get to do that if you start your article by saying opinion-driven articles are the problem. You can't then have opinion-driven response and be logically consistent. You can do whatever you want. I don't care. Live your life, man. But your article doesn't make the publication makes absolutely no sense. As a result, it's completely bankrupt intellectually bankrupt. So argument 6, spanking teaches a child that might makes right, that power and strength are most important, and that the biggest can force their will upon the smallest. Counterpoint, parental power is commonly exerted in routine child rearing, and spanking is only one example. Sure. Okay. I mean, how is this a counterpoint? Other situations where power and restraint are exercised by the average parent include the young child who insists on running from his parent in a busy mall or parking lot, the toddler who refuses to sit in his car seat, the young patient who refuses to hold still as a vaccination is administered or as a laceration is repaired. Okay. Power and control over the child are necessary at times to ensure safety, health, and proper behaviour. Classic child rearing studies have shown that some degree of power, assertion, and firm control is essential for optimal child rearing. When power is exerted in the context of love and for the child's benefit, the child will not perceive it as bullying or demeaning. No. Basically, there is no example on planet Earth where you could take where there isn't some alternative, and by doing it doesn't necessarily condemn you as a bad parent. It just means that the appropriate steps were not taken ahead of time to prepare the child for the for whatever it was. So we say the young child who insists on running from his parent in a busy mall or parking lot. You could have sat down with the child in the weeks running up to your big first day out in a busy mall and drawn some pictures and explained that it's good to stay close together in public, especially when you're little, and you draw up little characters and you have them talking to each other. And I mean, this is just one. There's a number of things you can do to make your child understand. Now, if it happens where the child just loses the run of himself for whatever reason and runs off, absolutely grabbing them is not calculatedly hitting them. It's not the same thing. It's so insane that he's grouped these things together. How can you do that honestly? I mean, okay, so let's go to the pure logic of it and go right down. You get a grown up and they're blind and they're about to cross the road and there's cars speeding down the road. The only way to save the guy's life is to grab them, right, and like wrestle them to the ground. And you might hurt them, you might even break an arm or something. But the guy can be reasoned with after and told, look, this was for your safety, this was for your protection. And the blind guy will go, absolutely, because when a car hits me, I would much prefer to have a broken arm than be potentially dead. When you're dealing with the same thing as a child, we're not talking about a child in imminent danger here. We're talking about if you are close enough to grab a child, right, from a danger, then you do that. You don't hit them after you grab them from a busy mall. You grab them for their safety. But when you're at home or wherever you are where they're being disobedient, they're not in danger. If there's some behavior that makes you upset, that isn't particularly social, it's not good for the kid to continue down this road, because if they take that out into the world, it's obviously going to be dreadful. And of course, just have a nice home. You want everybody getting on. Grabbing someone from an imminent danger is infinite. I mean, it's not even in the same universe as after the fact punishing someone. Those are two different things. Basically, what it would be is that the blind guy goes across the road, he nearly gets hit by a car. When you get to the other side, you run after him and you grab him and you say, look, you shouldn't have crossed the road. For your own protection, I'm going to have to bend you over and spank you. That's the parallel, and that's obviously insane. I mean, just, and the argument is that children don't have the same capacity, so they need to be hit, because, it's like you can't reason with them. If you can't reason with a child, right, if they're at an age when you can't reason with them, then you can't tell them what to do and what not to do. You can't tell them what's in their interest and what isn't. Therefore, hitting them is not going to change anything. It's just, they're just going to think you're a jerk, and they're going to be much more submissive and calm because now you're a dangerous jerk and they're afraid of you. So they will feign love and they'll feign affection in order to win your favor. And of course, when they grow older, you'll see the full effects of that. When they realize that they're big enough to fight back, they'll become a lot more rebellious, and that's not normal. It's not normal for children to go off and get completely wasted, drunk, and sleep around and all this. That's all just that's all just exposing the fake discipline that the parents gave them. So So no, I mean, and again, I mean, if you were to take the same argument and use on an elderly person who's lost the ability to reason, your 90-year-old grandmother drops over a cup of coffee and on the carpet, and you're like, no, grandmother, drop the pants and get into the bathroom. I'm going to have to. That's just weird. So it's like, this is not something that ever would have come about if it didn't exist already. If like the clock just started today and we had all the technology and all the kind of social setup today, and spanking hadn't been around, it would not come about now. It's the result of a very, very messed up history. And again, you go to my article and you can see the history there. And so what we have now today is people sustaining the abuse that was done to them in order to normalize it, because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to look back and say, wow, my parents were horrible, horrible people who hit me. So instead, I'm going to say that was actually a good thing, and so on. Anyway, okay, just moving on a bit here. Okay, so the publication kind of splits here. A closer look, distinguishing spanking from abuse. I'm not sure if I'll do this because this was already done. But actually, no, you want to see that. You want to hear this. Corporal punishment is often defined broadly as bodily punishment of any kind. This was not defined this way in my article or any of the studies that I cited, so this is already off base. But since this definition includes spanking as well as obviously abusive acts such as kicking, punching, beating, face slapping, and even starvation, more specific definitions must be used to separate appropriate versus inappropriate corporal punishment. Spanking is one of many disciplinary responses available to parents intended to shape appropriate behaviour in the developing toddler and child. It is an adjunctive corrective measure to be used in combination with primary responses such as restraint, natural and logical consequences, timeout, and restriction of privileges. Child development experts believe spanking should be used mainly as a backup to primary measures and then independently to correct deliberate and persistent problem behaviour that is not remedied with milder measures. So, child development experts, again, no sources. It is most useful with toddlers and preschoolers from 18 months to 6 years of age when reasoning is less persuasive. It's less persuasive because they can't do it as well as you can. So, okay. Moreover, child development experts say that spanking should always be a planned action by a parent, not an impulsive reaction to misbehavior. The child should be forewarned of the spanking consequence for each of the designated problem behaviors. Spanking should always be administered in private. It should consist of 1 or 2 spanks to the child's buttocks, followed by a calm review of the offence and the desired behaviour. That's not an issue. We in what I've done and numerous others in the same circle, we have specifically made sure that spanking is defined as, just a couple of strikes in the rear end in order to correct behaviour. Argument 7: spanking is violence. Counterpoint: spanking, as recommended by most primary care physicians. No, it's not recommended by most primary care physicians. It's the primary care physicians are remarkably silent on the issue. They won't touch it, probably for commercial reasons. They don't want to get involved in something so close to the bone, but they do not recommend it, as recommended by most primary care physicians. Is not violence by definition. Exertion of physical force so as to injure or abuse. Parents who properly spank do not injure or abuse their child. Sure, if violence is the definition is to injure, then absolutely not. No, it's not. But the definition of violence is to use force in order to get a particular outcome. As far as I'm concerned, you when in the absence of reasoning, you use force. That's fairly broad definition of violence. I think it's fair to use that. Carrying on, the use of this term violence in the spanking debate only serves to deepen the confusion. Why do anti-spanking authors repeatedly fail to distinguish between abusive violence and mild spanking? The distinction is so fundamental and obvious that its omission suggests that these authors use such terminology for its propaganda value, not to clarify issues. Now, aside from the fact that there's been numerous attempts at using terminology like elite circles and all that sort of stuff throughout this article, again, we've got a violation here of a standard. But even in saying that, they really do separate it. And even if they didn't, it wouldn't matter, because once you see the studies, you could categorize it as abusive in the same way that if you had a poison that could cause the same, in a syringe, and it could cause the same outcomes as spanking in the when we look at the data over mass groups of people, then yes, you really could call it abusive, and you don't need to separate it. But just so as not to get anyone's back up, it's fine to separate the two, and I'm happy to do that. But that really isn't one of the issues here. So argument 7 is null and void. Argument 8: spanking is an ineffective solution to misbehaviour. Counterpoint: though the specific use of appropriate spanking has rarely been studied, there is evidence of its short-term and long-term effectiveness. When combined with reasoning, the use of negative consequences, including spanking, does effectively decrease the frequency of misbehaviour reoccurrences with preschool children. It makes me sick. So when combined with reasoning, so this is like when you're sick, you have a cold, taking medicine and staying warm and wrapped up and having nice chicken soup and loads of water. When you combine that with ancient ritual incantations with voodoo dolls, then it tends to work a lot better. But so we're talking about spanking here. We're not talking about when as soon as you combine reasoning with it, you're in trouble, because the reasoning is now making up the deficiency, and that's exactly the argument that I'm making. So in clinical field trials where parental spanking has been studied, it has consistently been found to reduce the subsequent frequency of non-compliance with timeout. Spanking, as an effective enforcer of timeout, is a component of several well-researched parent training programs in popular parenting texts. Dr. Diana Baumrind of the Institute for Human Development at the University of California, Berkeley, conducted a decade-long study of families with children 3 to 9 years old. Baumrind found that parents employing a balanced disciplinary style of firm control, including spanking, and positive encouragement, experienced the most favourable outcome in their child. Parents taking extreme approaches to discipline, authoritarian types using excessive punishment, with less encouragement, or permissive types using little punishment and no spanking, were less successful. Sure, okay, like what are we saying here? This is not, I don't know. Anyway, Baumrind concluded that evidence from this study did not indicate that negative reinforcement or corporal punishment per se were harmful or ineffective procedures, but rather the total patterns of parental control determined the effects on the child of these procedures. This approach of balanced parenting, employing the occasional use of spanking, is advocated by several child-rearing experts. In the hands of loving parents, spanking to the buttocks of a defiant toddler. I'm just so angry. I see that and I just want to start killing people. This is where I get violent, and I'm I'm an advocate for non-aggression. But as soon as people start talking about hitting toddlers, man, this is like, publicly on the internet. I mean, in 150 years' time, people are going to look back on this. I mean, this author and Diana Baumrind and all these people, their great-grandchildren are going to look back on the internet and say, whoa, my great-grandmother was an evil woman. This person who wrote this article, that was my great-great-grandfather. He wrote this publicly and wasn't ashamed of it. This is like shocking stuff when the standard is, love and non-aggression and peace and teaching children how to reason so that the events never come out. I mean, imagine a world where children just don't cause you trouble, because they know how to reason, and parents are a lot more understanding of when that actually takes place, and they don't see a 2-year-old being defiant. It's crazy. Okay, argument number 9: adults who were spanked as children are at risk of using violence as a means of resolving conflicts as adults. This theory comes from the work done by Murray Strauss of the Family Research Lab at the University of New Hampshire. Strauss' conclusions are based upon theoretical models and survey results of adults recalling spankings as teenagers. His work is not clinical research, and many experts believe that this conclusion go far beyond his data. As with most of Strauss's survey research, teenage spanking is the focus, not the selective use of spanking of young children by reasonable parents. The evidence for his conclusion disappears when parental spanking is measured between the ages of 2 and 8, and when childhood aggression is measured at a later age. I'm going to just quickly quote from my own article, which is well sourced. Again, please do check it out and challenge me on this. That's totally cool. So at ages 2 to 3, children in punitive environments scored 39% higher on a scale of aggressive behaviour than children in non-punitive environments. Children aged 8 to 9 scored 83% higher. So this is over a course of 2 years, when you measure 2 years later. So you take a look at the snapshot of the child at 2 and 3, you go back to them when they're 5 and 6, and then similarly when they're 8 and 9, you go back when they're 10 and 12, and you see that children who were, and this is literally just, this is not taking into consideration that parents who don't hit their kids are also not necessarily, they don't have all the alternatives figured out. Maybe they just don't care about their kid and they just let them run wild. That's fine. But even in that, the score of aggression, and just for baseline antisocial behaviour, this is a proper science, and you find that in just 2 years, the aggressive behaviour, when scored against their peers, are 39% higher as small children and between 2 and 3, and then 5 and 6, and then 83% higher 8 and 9, which would be 10 to 12. So that just decimates argument 9 if the research is correct, which it is. So go have a look at that if you want to challenge that. So in 1994, a review article on corporal punishment, Dr. Robert E. Larzalaire, a director of research at Boys Town, Nebraska, presents evidence supporting a parent's selective use of spanking of children, particularly those 2 to 6 years old. After thoroughly reviewing the literature, Larzalaire concludes that any association between spanking and antisocial aggressiveness in children is insignificant and artifactual. Well, if that's his conclusion of 39% to 83% increase in aggressive behaviour, then that's fine, but that would be an opinion. So that's Larzalaire's opinion. After a decade of longitudinal study of children beginning in 3rd grade, Dr. Leonard Aron found no association between punishment, including spanking, and later aggression. Aron, a clinical psychologist at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, concluded, upon follow-up 10 years later after the original data collection, we found the punishment of aggressive acts at the earlier age was no longer related to current aggression, and instead other variables like parental nurturance and children's identification with their parents were more important in predicting later aggression. Now, that's a very, very interesting thing to say. So he noticed a difference between different parenting styles and was able to find that parental nurturance and children's identification with their parents was more important. Parental nurturance and children's identification with parents is a result of a reasonable relationship rather than punitive. So I'm really not sure what the argument is here. He's just kind of saying stuff at this point. So I'll just carry on. Again, it is total pattern of parenting that determines the outcome of parents' efforts. Absolutely nobody on this earth is arguing that spanking makes kids evil, and that's it. And it's not. It's the total pattern of parenting that determines the outcome of parents' efforts is, of course, true. I mean, come on, like, obviously. So, argument 10, spanking leads a parent to use harmful forms of corporal punishment which lead to physical child abuse. The abuse potential when loving parents use appropriate disciplinary spanking is very low. Since parents have a natural affection for their children, they are more prone to underutilize spanking than to overutilize it. Both empirical data and professional opinion oppose the concept of causal relationship between spanking and child abuse. Surveys indicate that 70 to 90% of parents of preschoolers use spanking. Preschoolers. 70 to 90% of parents use spanking on preschoolers. Yet the incidence of physical child abuse in America is only about 5%. Well, that's just a definitional shift. I mean, come on, be honest here. Statistically, the two practices are far apart. Furthermore, over the past decade, reports of child abuse have steadily risen while approval for parental spanking has steadily declined. More than 70% of primary care pediatricians reject the idea that spanking sets the stage for parents to engage in forms of physical abuse. Teaching parents appropriate spanking may actually reduce child abuse. According to Larzalaire, in his 1994 review article on corporal punishment, parents who are ill-equipped to control their child's behaviour or who take more permissive approach, refusing to use spanking, may be more prone to anger and explosive attacks on their child. Yes, if you remove spanking and don't replace it with anything else like a relationship, sure, then you are going to get anger and explosive attacks on their child. Parental child abuse is an interactive process involving parental competence, parental and child temperaments, and situational demands. Abusive parents are more angry, depressed, and impulsive, and emphasize punishment as the predominant means of discipline. Abused children are more aggressive and less compliant than children from non-abusive families. There is less interaction between family members in abusive families, and abusive mothers display more negative than positive behaviour. The etiology of abusive parenting is multifactorial and with emphasis on the personalities involved, and cannot be simply explained by a parent's use of spanking. Obviously not. Again, this is not the argument. In a letter to the editor in 1995 issue of Pediatrics, Dr. Lawrence S. Wisso and Deborah Roter of Johns Hopkins University's Pediatrics Department acknowledged that a definitive link between spanking and child abuse has yet to be established. Finally, the Swedish experiment to reduce child abuse by banning spanking seems to be failing. In 1980, 1 year after this ban was adopted, the rate of child beatings was twice that of the United States. According to 1995 report from the government organisation Statistics Sweden, police reports of child abuse by family members rose fourfold from 1984 to 1994, while reports of teen violence increased nearly sixfold. This is very, very interesting because what's being said here is that spanking is not going to be a determining factor, even if it's bad or good or whatever. It's not a factor one way or the other. It's going to be you take the full pattern, and now what he's saying is, but if you take away spanking, all hell breaks loose, and that's to be blamed on spanking. It's remarkable, and it's also misleading here. He says in 1980, 1 year after its ban was adopted, the rate of child beatings was twice that of the United States. Now, the kind of trick here is that you would think that it means that after 1980, if you kind of skim it, you would go 1980, a year after the ban was adopted, the rate of child beatings doubled. But what he did here was he said the rate of child beatings doubled the numbers of the United States. So we don't know what the numbers were prior to that. So it's a very strange thing to do, to take all of a sudden another country. That just seems straight out disingenuous. But according to 1995 report from government, blah, 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 child abuse, blah, 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 rose fourfold from 84 to 94. I can guarantee you it's not because the government introduced a law for against spanking. Right. Most experts agree that spanking and child abuse are now not in the same continuum, but are very different entities. With parenting, it is the user and how a measure is used much more than the measure used that determines the outcome of the disciplinary effort. Clearly, spanking can be safely used in discipline of young children with excellent outcome. The proper use of spanking may actually reduce a parent's risk of abusing a child. In other words, if you don't allow if you don't allow parents to hit their children every now and then, they might just explode and hit them even more. Like, this is this is literally his argument right here. Moving on. This is pretty much it. The last one, argument 11: spanking is never necessary. Counterpoint: all children need a combination of encouragement and correction as they are disciplined to become socially responsible individuals. In order for correction to deter disobedient behavior, the consequence imposed upon the child must outweigh the pleasure of the disobedient act. Nope. That's just... I was such a Hobbesian view, like these little animals, and we need to... No, it's much better if you do it. Like, come on. What, like... There's no ethics here. You basically have to throw ethics out the window if you want to agree with this article. For very compliant children, milder forms of correction will suffice, and spanking may never be necessary. For more defiant children who refuse to comply with or be persuaded by milder consequences such as time out, spanking is useful, effective, and appropriate. Conclusion: the subject of disciplinary spanking should be evaluated from a factual and philosophical perspective. Nice one, philosophical. Try that on your own publication here, because literally not an ounce of philosophy was used here. I mean, we have contradiction after contradiction. We have straw men. We have just violations of the established standard. And actually, you know, if you're going to go the philosophical route, you're going to start the publication off with some definitions which are absent and which were kind of just, you know, shoehorned in as it suited the point later on. Philosophical perspective, that's hilarious. It must be distinguished from abusive, harmful forms of corporal punishment. Appropriate disciplinary spanking can play an important role in optimal child development and has been found in prospective studies to be a part of the parenting style associated with the best outcomes. There is no evidence that mild spanking is harmful. Indeed, spanking is supported by history, research, and a majority of primary care physicians. Absolutely isn't. No, it isn't. Not supported by a history. Certainly not supported by the research, and the majority of primary care physicians also do. I mean, even if they did, which they don't, who cares? You know, why is that the argument here? So there's just tacked onto the end of this article, there's some guidelines for disciplinary spanking. It's just basically a manual on how to be a sadist with your kid. Like, it's just weird. Spanking should be used selectively for clear, deliberate misbehaviour, particularly that which arises from a child's persistent defiance of a parent's instruction. It should only be used when the child receives at least as much encouragement and praise for good behaviour. Milder forms of blah blah blah. How many parent? Let me see here. Oh, there's one point just at the very end. Spanking should always be administered in private bedroom or restroom to avoid public humiliation or embarrassment. If you want to avoid humiliation and embarrassment, you don't bend your child over and control them and hit them in order to send a message to their limbic system and tell them that they've just disobeyed you. That's just not right. So I've left out. He didn't really address any of the arguments and any of the points in my article, Spare the Rod, not Spare the Rod. That's his version, as a question mark after it. Mine is Spare the Rod, ... And in that you can find the actual arguments against spanking and how it's absolutely some of the most devastating. It's one of the most devastating things you can do to a child. Increased child aggression, increased delinquent and antisocial behaviour, increased physical abuse, increased adult aggression, increased adult criminal behaviour, increased risk of abusing your own spouse or child, a decreased quality of parent-child relationship, decreased child mental health, and decreased adult mental health. And all of this is cited. I have the specific studies linked to that all show this. And these are real studies. These are really scientific. These use actual science, actual scientific method. They don't use opinion and then criticize other people for using opinion. This is just straight up science, and there are no opinions in it. You can just grab your data and take from it what you will. So So thanks so much for listening. Do stop by counterintuition.com. Check out Counterintuition on Twitter. It's COUNTRI counter I. And on Facebook, just type Counterintuition in there. Get on over there, leave some comments, drop me email, office@counterintuition.com, and download more podcasts. I got loads more. Go get them and listen away. And if you have any disagreements, and I particularly like disagreements, but your encouragements have been lovely so far. Everybody's been so nice and friendly, but if you've got any problem, any bone to pick whatsoever, do just drop me a comment. Maybe we'll even do a show together over Skype or something. So yeah, thanks again. Have a lovely day.